And joining us once again, one of the early Left Reckoning guests is, or maybe that was the late TMBS guest. I'm kind of getting my timelines mixed
No, I
up.
think we did on LR.
Was it LR? Okay, cool. He's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Utah and Jane Family Institute Senior Fellow of Higher Education Finance. Marshall Steinbaum, thank you so much for joining us again.
It's great to be back.
So, what prompted your return, or for me to reach out for you, is this? Justin Wolfers, not one of my favorite economists, tweeted out this study by Brookings Institution, and I just want to share a little bit of it because I was looking at this and I still can't quite understand the graph that they purport to show that if we relieved student loan debt, it would be a regressive policy, and it would basically just help like yuppies. I guess is sort of the implication. So. But actually, before I share this graph, Marshall, what is the current status of the student loan debt situation in America? What is that? How does that emerge historically? Is this something we've always dealt with back in colonial times, or is this a new thing? And how does that compare internationally?
Sure. Well, as you may have heard, there's a lot more student debt in the United States now than there used to be even in the relatively recent past. So now we're north of like $1.7 trillion in outstanding student loans. The student loan program has been steadily growing since the 1960s or so, but it kind of took a huge increase in significance around the 2000s, coinciding with declining state funding for public higher education institutions, which educate the vast majority of students at both the the vast majority of the undergraduate level, I think a small majority, a slight majority in the graduate level in this country. So loss of state funding meant that institutions had to adopt higher tuition policies in order to replace the lost revenue and basically keep going at the same size they had been, and in fact increasing in their size and footprint in many cases. And they have in effect moved from being a public funding, public good type model to private funding, or at least notionally funded through private student tuition, which is then backstopped by federal student loans. So in effect, like the same way if you go to a car dealership and want to buy a car, but can't come up with, whatever tens of thousands of dollars it is to buy a new car on the spot, you can get an auto loan. And it didn't take that long for car companies to figure out that it was a good idea to have a bank attached to them so that they could approve their own customers for loans to buy this very expensive product right off the bat, so they could vastly increase the set of customers who were in the market for such a large purchase. The same is true in higher education, except instead of the bank being attached to the universities, that might give them some pause when it comes to extending uneconomic loans. That bank is attached to the federal government, especially since the feds had been subsidizing private institutions to originate student loans for many decades up until the Great Recession, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Since then, new student lending has been more or less solely the province of the federal government. And their federal government's view is that more people going to college and going to college for longer and getting more degrees is good for the economy. That's the basic mindset of the Department of Education. And so they've originated loans more or less without limit and with decreasing limits as time has gone on. The other big piece of the student loan puzzle is that employers have been requiring more higher education and more degrees to get a given job. So, whereas it was once the case that you could enter the labor market without having touched the higher education system, as that system has become more private and more exploitative, it's also become, in some sense, more universal that people have some experience of it before entering the labor market. And this is why it's not just wrong, but offensive to paint student debt as solely the province of a wealthy elite or yuppie type class, as you correctly alluded to this Brookings Institution publication. You asked where student debt currently stands. I mean, that's kind of the big picture overview. We've had a pause on loan repayments since the start of the pandemic. So the federal government basically, by fiat, reduced the interest on outstanding loans to 0% for the indefinite future starting in March of 2020. And they basically waived required principal repayments. So if you have outstanding student loans with the feds, you have not had to make payments now for nearly 2 years. Biden had been planning to end that repayment pause as of, I think, January 30th, so a few days from now. About a month ago, that policy was change of course to extend it, I think, through May of 2022 as of now.
Right, and Omicron was a justification for that extension. So we have this. I'll share this now, and this is kind of what got people in a tizzy. I mean, this is just a recurrence of a kind of a regular argument you hear from folks like this, which is that, like we said, it's for yuppies. But here, just to put it out there, is Justin Wolfers quoted. This said, almost a third of all student loan debt is owed by the wealthiest 20% of households, and only 8% by the bottom 20%. And then you get this graph here, and. Who owns student debt by income and wealth quintile? And there's all these things like financial wealth, face value, excluding human capital. Like, what can you help? Like, what is this?
All right, so this graph comes from a recent publication by a guy named Adam Looney, who is actually also a professor at the University of Utah in the business school, so my counterpart department, and he has been a skeptic of student debt cancellation for a while now. He was the chief economist of the Office of Tax Analysis in the Obama administration, and had worked at Brookings, I think, before that, and then after that as well, and then moved to the University of Utah, and he became a kind of student debt pundit as a result of a paper he wrote when he was in the administration and then published through Brookings after he left, that linked data on repayment that the Department of Education keeps. So student debtors and their history of repaying student debt, how much they paid over time, linked that to tax returns that he had access to in the Treasury Department. So this was a paper that was published in 2015. It was highly influential and illuminating in some ways, though it certainly reflected a particular viewpoint that has become even more evident as time has gone on, and specifically in this most recent publication. Since then, Looney has not been able to conduct original research in the realm of student debt, because that publication turned out to have violated the Department of Education's rules on who is allowed to access their microdata, so data on loan repayment. And so not only can nobody replicate that study, nobody can do any other studies at all using the data that the Department of Education has, at least up to the present. I think I'm correct in saying they've not approved any further research. And so sort of all we have to go on, I mean, not all, because I've done my own research, but coming from official government sources, all we have to go on is as what Looney was able to produce in that time when he was on the inside, and which he can no longer produce. So this study, I mean, I want to talk about exactly the graph that you just showed and how it relates to the overall research on student debt. What you just depicted is a breakdown of the wealth distribution according, and the bars in the graph are how much student debt is held by certain quantiles, it's called, so portions of the wealth distribution. Like the bottom fifth would be the poorest 20% of people, the next 20 to 40% of people, and so on up to the top 20%. And so you can see there the blue bars are depicting what Looney calls financial wealth, and this is basically what this is. This graph suggests that there's one wealth distribution, but in fact what's being depicted is three different ones. Financial wealth is the actual wealth that households hold. That is the number that's direct from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is one of the few data sets that can be used to study student debt in the absence of the data that I previously referred to that we no longer have access to. That is a survey of households that says, basically how much is your house worth, how much is your mortgage. So there's your net worth is the difference between how much is your house and how much is your mortgage. It asks, how much credit card debt are you carrying, how much auto debt are you carrying, what's the value of your car. So, you could basically construct a household wealth distribution on the basis of the questions that are asked in the survey. And it asks people, do you have student debt and how much do you have? And so it's the way, I have used that data set myself to ascertain what portions of the wealth distribution have how much student debt, and what is crucially, what's the ratio of household wealth to, of student debt to household wealth. Okay, so the blue bars in that chart conceive the wealth distribution as exactly what's in the Survey of Consumer Finances, and it shows that the bottom 20%, the bottom fifth of households have the vast majority, or I guess just over 50% of all the student debt, and then the other 80% of households have a much lower portion of student debt, and by and large, those shares are decreasing. I mean, it looks to me like it's decreasing between the middle quintile and the top two. But if you just look at what's in the survey of consumer finances, the takeaway is the poorest people have the vast majority of student debt. Okay, so that goes against the talking points that motivate this idea that student debt cancellation is regressive. So what Looney's done here is basically recalculate household wealth to include what he calls human capital, which says that people who go to college earn more than people who don't go to college. And so if we take the difference between those income, that future income between the college educated and the non-college educated, we will treat that as wealth. We'll basically add that up. So if you say a 30-year-old person now, and you have some amount of student debt and your wealth is like zero or negative because of that student debt, instead of saying that's your wealth, that zero or negative number, we're going to say actually your wealth is the sum over your entire lifetime of the difference between what you earn having had a college degree and what you would have earned had you not had a college degree. We're going to add that up to the present, say that's your wealth, the same way that cash in your bank account would be your wealth. And then if we recalculate the wealth distribution that way, then it turns out that the people who have student debt have a lot more wealth, because according to Looney, that means they're going to have more income in the future.
Knock on wood.
Yeah, well, I mean, knock on wood is not a term that serious social scientists should be using ever in reference to their work. And yet that is basically the assumption underlying Looney's procedure there, because he's saying in the survey of consumer finances, not only is your future income and the difference between that and what you would have earned had you not gone to college, not only is that not available to you now to repay your student loans, a seemingly obvious problem there, it's implicitly using the income of people who are currently old to predict the income path of people who are not currently old. And the fact is there's a great deal of cohort effects in the income distribution. So if you're a 30-year-old person with a college degree and $50,000 of student debt right now, you're going to have a very different income profile in your life than someone who's currently 75 years old, has a college degree that they got back when they were 25 or 22 or whatever, many years ago, and has subsequently earned, some trajectory over the course of their lifetime. That the first is, or the second is not a counterfactual for the first, as any, bare bones labor economist, or you don't have to be an economist to figure that one out, and yet that kind of shoddy work is being used to create the talking point on the part of wolfers that you referred to. Like all they want to be able to say is, you may have seen Steinbaum's or anybody else's publication that says canceling student debt is not regressive because it turns out that in fact it's poor people who have student debt, but you shouldn't believe that it's actually rich people who have it, and don't look too hard.
Yeah, like get that on Biden's desk so he can be like, okay, well then we won't do it, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And you can tell by the way that Biden and members of his administration have been talking about student debt that this is really what they think. So as far as I'm concerned, my job as an economist is to surprise people by telling them true things that are at odds with what they previously thought about how the world works. I think that's kind of why I get paid a salary to conduct research, and I would say that what's going on here is that various credentialed social scientists have come up with ways to tell powerful people that what they already think is true, even when it's not true. The New Republic had a very interesting article this morning that referred to this situation that's here, where they quoted a executive of a for-profit higher education institution basically saying that he didn't want debt to be canceled because that would make him look bad, because institutions would have to confront the fact that with their claims about their degrees leading to higher earnings would be false, because if they were true, then people would be able to repay their loans, and the reality is that they're not able to repay their loans. So all the political kind of rhetorical push is on the side of kick the can down the road, pretend there's not a problem. If people aren't repaying their loans, then come up with some way of disguising that fact, or just sort of pushing it into the future, not having the tough conversation like our higher education policy that's premised on individuals taking out loans in order to pay for college degrees so that colleges can expand and keep their enrollment up, that policy has not been a success. And I don't think that the administration should be on the side of essentially not creating PR problems for for-profit higher education institutions, or for nonprofit ones, for that matter. Rather, many of their constituents and their voters have their lives being destroyed by outstanding student loans, and that should be the interest that takes priority in terms of policymaking.
Yeah, and what really galls me about this is the phony class politics. And we talked about this with actually the contractors too, but like the phony class politics in this case being, we don't want to benefit those college-educated folks so much. Well, what you could do is relieve the student loans that force them to work for these corporate jobs, and then tax them on the back end, right? Like, if you actually are concerned about that, that's the solution.
Also, we know that the Biden administration doesn't care at all about horrible class politics because Jen Psaki is still employed there.
yeah, exactly. Dave, you want to say something?
Oh no, I mean, I just sort of wanted to note there too that, like, the economics is one thing, but the politics of this from the folks who are, against any kind of serious like student loan cancellation program. It's strange to me to see liberals so committed to this kind of, as Matt was saying, like phony class politics, because, the solution to get around this is just to make things universal, right? Like, if it's a benefit that everybody enjoys, right, the potential of being able to go to, 4-year university and get a degree, then you don't have to target or scapegoat or marginalize different groups, about it, right? Like, that's the solution right there if you're worried about some people feeling left out.
Well, I think that has that sort of, or I should say, the opposite of what you just said, has a long history in the politics of higher education. That we shouldn't have public higher education because most people who are college educated are situated in a high class position, and so, say for example, a public university system is in effect taxing non-college educated people, that is to say, the citizens of the state, in order to create a benefit that is disproportionately accrued by the children of the well-off. And that is deeply perverse. Pete Buttigieg voiced a version of that in the Democratic primary debates, to much less pushback, frankly, than it should have gotten. The fact is, the only way higher education has ever been egalitarian, if it could ever have been called that, is through being a public good and having admissions policies that make it possible for anybody who has the academic background and desire to get a degree to do so in the absence of considerations of their own net worth and their own parental background. That's what higher education as a public good means, and it is absolutely not regressive. Higher education not as a public good is extremely regressive. That's the situation that we have now, where the best resourced institutions are basically country clubs that decide who gets in on the basis of who your parents are, and who can make donations and so on. And there's been there's interesting research in higher education economics surrounding who goes to which college, that on the one hand, the higher education system is enormously stratified, and the more so as public institutions that are the part of it that were ever relatively egalitarian, as those are defunded and consequently come to act more as private institutions. That is to say, they want the students who are able to pay full tuition, and who are going to earn the most coming out of it. And so that means admissions processes that select for that and exclude people from disadvantaged and otherwise non-traditional backgrounds. That higher education system as a whole has become more stratified and inegalitarian as it has become less public, and as public funding has been eliminated. I mean, it's from a tax perspective, it's also false to say that if you fund a higher education institution from a public budget, then that means that you're taxing the poor to pay for a benefit for the rich. I mean, I think a much better account of the politics of higher education at the state level is a revolt by the largely white tax base against any idea that the public institution might be accessible to people who don't look like themselves and the children of people who don't look like themselves.
And I mean, this is anecdotal, but I grew up in the South, like a poor white kid in the South, and when I would talk to people about this issue about college, becoming more and more unaffordable for us, the retort you'd always get from the kids who grew up in the country club, golf clubs, is like, well, this is what happened because they started letting too many of, the government started forcing us to accept students who couldn't afford it, and then college became unaffordable because of that. right? Because and then obviously the second part of that argument that they're not saying is that I don't think people like y'all should be going to school.
Yeah, yeah, and exactly, and that is very much behind things like the Looney paper that Brookings published. It's like higher education should only be the preserve of the rich, and in order to keep it that way, we're going to say it already is the preserve of the rich to thwart any policy that would make it somewhat more egalitarian.
And this, I mentioned the colonial times earlier, but this reminds me of Governor Berkeley of Virginia, who was against any sort of education. He said it will bring disobedience, heresy, and sex into the world. And it's like that's basically like we still got that. We've brought that back. That's like we're going to punish you for having gotten an education, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of I don't know exactly what dates on that statement, but I would guess it's reflective.
1700s.
Okay.
Or 1600s, yeah.
Oh, 1600. Wow. Okay.
He was in the English Civil War, yeah. So
I mean, I was going to refer to Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, and the treatment of John C. Calhoun and his politics that appear in that as a precursor to today's sort of libertarian, anti-public good politics, because I think Calhoun rightly perceived that a state that has the wherewithal to provide public goods for its citizens is a state that has the potential, at least, to threaten the interests of the property holding elite. And in his case, he meant the slave holding elite. And I think that is a big part of the politics of anti-student debt cancellation and anti-integration and full funding of public higher education. It's like, we rely on these sort of societal institutions that perform the function of sorting the people into who's worthy and unworthy to be in our company. And we are against any type of policy that might throw open the gates of these elitist institutions to people who aren't like ourselves and that we don't want to see.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of things since we have you, I'd like to ask you about. I mean, one of the other arguments that they also, people who are against cancellation really rely on is the argument that medical professionals and lawyers, hold large amounts of school debt. And when we're talking about, if you basically exclude those groups, then the numbers don't look so bad. Is that the case?
Well, no, I mean, there's, it's a tiny minority of student debtors that are in those categories. Yeah, they do have a disproportionate amount of the total outstanding balance, but I would say a couple of things about that. I mean, as it relates to cancellation, many of the people, if your image of a student debtor is somebody who attended a very high tuition professional school and has a job in the private sector where they earn a huge salary, so they will eventually pay it back, so why should we cancel it? Those people have by and large refinanced out of the federal system, so they are not eligible for cancellation. The reason why they're able to refinance out of the federal system is exactly because they're very good credit risks. A private lender can come along and say, okay, the federal loans are cheap as unsecured debt goes. That is to say, they're handing out loans to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to qualify for them on terms that those people can at least barely afford, or at least can be contemplated to afford. And then the private lenders come in and say, they don't originate student loans for people who are entering, still paying tuition. Their niche is basically cream skimming the good credit risks among the federal loans and saying, we'll give you a lower interest rate if you refinance out with a private loan. And that is an offer that can only be made to people in the category that you said. And that, having taken that offer, they're not eligible to have their debt canceled anymore because the federal government doesn't own it. So, that certainly should play into this distributional politics of this specific question of cancellation. As to the overall role that expensive professional schools play in higher education finance more broadly, and how that affects the wealth distribution at large, you might say. First of all, yeah, it's true that some people who go to such institutions might earn high salaries and have high debts, but the people who really earn high salaries, having gone to those institutions, and especially having gone to the fanciest ones, are the people who didn't need loans to pay for them in the first place, or may have already paid them off. So if you're looking at people sitting on a large amount of medical school debt or law school debt, those may be people, first of all, whose parents weren't able to pay for their graduate school for them, or entered professions where they don't earn enough to retire those debts on the 10-year time scale that the federal system presupposes. So that causes, so either they enter income-driven repayment or something like that increases the balances over time rather than decreases them. And they're just not, like, the idea that people aren't repaying their loans. I mean, this is another, so Looney's paper, not only does it make this false assumption that your future income is part of your current wealth, it also makes the assumption that your current loan balance is actually the sum of your future payments, as opposed to the actual balance that it is. And this idea that it's the sum of your future payments says that if you're enrolled in income-driven repayment or otherwise in a program that doesn't require you to make your monthly payments, then it's as though your student debt doesn't exist, basically. Like, it's like, if you're not making payments on it, then the balance isn't there, and that's absolutely false as a statement of economic reality. I mean, it's kind of funny because he's taking it from a paper by two finance professors, one at University of Chicago Business School and the other at the Penn Business School. You know, that's not true on the basis of basic principles of finance, because it says that, you know, if you have your loan, say you never make any payments on your loan and are enrolled in an income-driven repayment program and have your balance forgiven in 20 years, which hasn't actually happened for that many people, you know, because the programs aren't that old. But suppose that the program operates exactly as designed, which is the assumption of that paper. That's saying that a cancellation of your outstanding debt in 20 years is worth the same to you as not having that debt right now, which is, as if you're familiar with basic principles of finance and time discounting, that is absolutely not a principle that finance professors should be adhering to in any context. But, you know, any supposed rigor and consistent assumptions go out the window if they need to serve the ultimate ideological conclusion of, oh, actually student debt isn't that bad, and we'll basically put whatever numbers we have to down in order to be able to cite something in support of that point.
And I'll tell you, I mean, the politics of it truly does, like, it boggles the mind, because you can see how this could really, when you bring it to people, be extremely popular. Like, maybe some people at the Brookings Institution can get like really worked up about it. I don't understand, like, as in terms of like getting votes, who this is really working for. But on top of that, like, the funniest thing is on Twitter, if you ever sort of, you know, push back against these things, there is a certain kind of class of like neoliberal character who loves to go through all of the different repayment plan options that you have, and whether like 7 or 8 of them, right? And I can't imagine more of like a neoliberal hellscape kind of solution to this big social problem than like, no, you need to pick like out of these 8 different plans and educate yourself on what happens over the next 30 years and hope that you make the right choice now so that you can be able to, you know, make big purchases later in life.
Yeah, and you know, unlike these people who have an axe to grind, scholars who actually study the income-driven repayment programs that you're referring to show that the people who make use of them are, in fact, disproportionately on the better off end of things in the student debt scale. Exactly because if you have more outstanding loans, then it's worth more, or more higher balance outstanding, then it's worth more to you to actually figure that shit out. And also that, you know, this is like, as we've seen in the implementation of countless social programs, you know, if you make the eligibility requirements as minute as possible in order to please the wonks at the Brookings Institute, you're not going to have a very effective social program, because it just takes so long for actual human beings to figure out how to navigate it, and many of them don't and won't, because they rightly feel that they don't have that much to gain from navigating an opaque and dysfunctional system.
What should the model be? You know, I'm thinking back to when I was in the UK for a little bit, like 2013 fact checking, 2011. This was right after Clegg got just blown out because of the tuition fee thing. And I was looking back at that, and it's like they only instituted tuition fees in 1998.
Yeah.
I basically, like, should we just extend college like it's high school? Like, what should a higher education be in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's useful to have the UK as this counterfactual for that. You know, things aren't inevitably the way they are in the US. The fact is that country chose to make their higher education system more like the US higher education system starting in the 1990s, and especially over the course of the period 2000 to 2010, as you're referring to the coalition government at the beginning of 2010 or 2011. You know, so Clegg had promised to rescind tuition fee increases that had been done on the previous Labour government, and then once he formed this coalition, he in fact tripled them in coalition with the Conservatives on the same, you know, Buttigieg-like belief that charging higher tuition for higher education was actually an egalitarian policy, because that would mean that the working class, non-college educated wouldn't be paying for these elite educations for the children of the well-off who would be educated anyway. And they're in exactly the same situation we are now, which is that it didn't deter people from going to college because they had credentialization in the labor market happening contemporaneously. So lots of people did, in fact, more people did go to college and took out their huge student loans. And now the issue is on the repayment end. They're not having the repayments that they expected, just the same way that we're not. So to finally answer your question, what should our higher education system look like? It should look like the system that the UK left behind, which is a public good where there's not that much of a diversity between institutions. So it's long been considered that a strength of the U.S. Higher education landscape is exactly that there's lots of diversity within it, meaning there's some place in it for everyone. That was supposed to be supposedly the reason why U.S. had higher education attainment earlier than equivalent countries in Europe. So basically high school was universal in the U.S. More or less before World War II, other than black people in the South. That universal secondary education wasn't achieved in Europe until like the 60s or something like that. And similarly, with higher education, the U.S. had much higher rates earlier on. The view was it's because we have so many different institutions that there's a place for everyone in the system somewhere. I think in reality, a more homogeneous system is one that is more egalitarian, at least, where it doesn't really matter where you go to college. Forget this kind of admissions rat race that you get among the most elite institutions, because that only tells you that there's this essentially arbitrary sorting going on where a highly significant decision is being made about you at age 18. It's also not, that specifically, very low, very highly selective, very low admissions rate type institution is not the experience of most people in higher education, but segregation absolutely is the experience of most people in higher education. The reason why there's such low admissions rates in the Ivy League is because it really, really matters which school you go to, at least when it comes to this social sorting. So my view is, a good higher education system is one where, it's basically a three-tier system, like under the California Master Plan that created, on the one hand, the University of California pre-existed the California Master Plan, but basically that's what instituted the system where you've got research universities, undergraduate teaching universities that offer 4-year degrees, and then community colleges that offer 2-year and professional degrees. And within that overall schema, there shouldn't be that much difference between the different institutions that sit in different ones of those tiers, nor should there be that and I think that institutional homogeneity would lead to diversity and heterogeneity among the students at those institutions. So institutional heterogeneity in the existing system leads to segregation and homogeneity in terms of who goes to which institution. And I think the converse is true in a more fully public system.
Yeah, and I just want to circle back to that Clegg point about, let's look out for the non-college educated. It's like, well, how about we take some concern that their wages haven't been rising, or in this country, like give them health care, like stop their rent from increasing, or like if at any point they want to, stop and go get an education, like maybe when they're like in their 30s, they can go do that. Like I would love to see that from higher education. Like it's something that's open to everybody, not just like you said, like this thing that sorts you after high school.
Right. And I was just having this conversation with my friend and colleague Centric DePaul about the sort of vanishing phenomenon of the mid-career or late career enrollee who is basically just interested in seeing, getting a degree, maybe, whether or not they had one from when they were so-called college age, they might be interested in getting one now. And, if it costs $30,000, they're not going to do that. But if it costs $3,000, that's something that somebody might do because they're interested. Like that is a beautiful vision of what a public higher education would look like. And, it's basically vanished.
And that will lead to less resentment between this college educated, non-college educated, that I think like these folks are really trying to,
they're trying to like throw gasoline on the fire. And, I don't know, I think Looney went to Dartmouth and Harvard, the set of people who think that higher education is supposedly this elitist phenomenon that shouldn't be open to anybody who isn't like themselves. You can tell where they came from in the system.
That's funny. Well, Marshall Steinbaum, thank you so much. Folks, you can follow you on, where can people follow you on Twitter?
My handle is econ_Marshall.
Econ_Marshall, folks, one of the best econ followers on the Twitter Twitter feed. So check
If
that out.
you like roasting Justin Wolfers and other pseudo economists, please do come follow me.
Left Reckoners love that stuff, so I'm sure they will.
Right.
Oops.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate Marshall's perspective on these sorts of things. Particularly, I mean, people should go back to when we talked about Nancy McLean being right. It's a very important topic. The way that this stuff was. This is politics, political economy, folks. Let's think about the choices
We're
that are
bringing
being
the politics
made.
back to economy, baby.
Yeah.
Much needed.